One of the biggest misconceptions about avoidant people is believing they keep their distance because you are never important to them. In reality, the opposite is often much closer to the truth. Thoughtful. One of the most painful ironies of avoidant attachment is that the people who matter the most can become the very people they struggle to stay close to. Once you truly understand this pattern, many of their confusing actions begin to fit together. Pause. An avoidant doesn't always withdraw because the relationship lacked meaning. They don't suddenly become distant because there was no emotional connection. Size. Quite often, they step away because the connection became too significant. It reached a level that awakened emotions they no longer knew how to manage. When an avoidant meets someone who creates genuine emotional safety, deep understanding, authentic intimacy, or a powerful sense of attachment, their nervous system doesn't experience that closeness as peaceful. Instead, it reacts as though something dangerous is happening. This is where so many people misread the situation. For you, growing emotionally closer usually creates trust, comfort, and security. For an avoidant, that same closeness can feel like the beginning of losing control. It challenges the emotional walls they've depended on for years to feel safe. So while you experience the relationship as becoming stronger, they may experience it as becoming overwhelming. When you feel deeply connected, they may feel emotionally trapped. When you believe something meaningful is beginning, they may feel old fears rising back to the surface, fears they buried long ago because they believed that was the only way to protect themselves. The truth is that avoidants are rarely frightened by love itself. What scares them is everything love asks of them. Real intimacy requires vulnerability. It requires depending on another person, allowing someone to matter, and accepting the possibility of emotional pain. Those are the experiences their nervous system has learned to avoid. For many avoidants, childhood taught them that emotional closeness wasn't consistently safe. Love may have been unpredictable, conditional, overwhelming, or emotionally unavailable. Expressing needs may have led to rejection, criticism, disappointment, or neglect. Over time, they adapted. Instead of learning how to remain emotionally connected through difficult moments, they learned how to survive without relying on anyone. Becoming fiercely independent wasn't simply a personality trait, it became a survival strategy. Self-reliance turned into emotional armor. Keeping people at a comfortable distance became the system their mind used to stay regulated. Because of this, relationships that remain casual, emotionally shallow, or lacking genuine vulnerability often feel surprisingly manageable. Nothing inside them feels threatened because very little is being asked of them emotionally. Everything changes, however, when they meet someone who truly understands them, someone who notices the parts they've spent years hiding, someone who offers patience instead of pressure, someone whose emotional presence naturally creates trust without forcing intimacy. Ironically, this kind of connection can activate their deepest defenses, not because you are unsafe, but because you are emotionally significant. You become a reflection of the parts of themselves they have spent years avoiding. And facing that reflection can feel far more uncomfortable than maintaining emotional distance. A mirror has a way of revealing everything you've worked hard not to see. For someone who has spent much of life disconnecting from difficult emotions, being fully seen can feel both comforting and terrifying at the same time. This explains why avoidants so often appear contradictory. In the beginning, they may be powerfully attracted to you. They may pursue the relationship with genuine excitement, curiosity, and emotional intensity because the connection feels refreshing and different from anything they've experienced before. But as the bond deepens and the relationship begins moving beyond attraction into true emotional attachment, the same feelings that once pulled them closer can suddenly trigger the instinct to create distance. At first, they may let you into parts of themselves that almost no one else gets to see. They might tell you stories they've never shared, reveal old wounds, talk about their hopes for the future, or express thoughts that feel deeply personal. In those moments, it can seem like the relationship is moving towards something truly meaningful. Then, almost without warning, everything changes. Just as the emotional connection begins to feel secure, just as you start believing you're building something lasting, their behavior shifts. The warmth begins to fade. Conversations become shorter. Their consistency disappears. They seem emotionally unavailable, less expressive, and increasingly distant. From where you're standing, it feels like you've been abandoned without explanation. From where they're standing, it feels like their emotional system is becoming overwhelmed. Deep inside, their nervous system begins sounding an alarm. It tells them, this relationship is becoming too important. If this continues, I could get hurt. I could lose my independence. I could become emotionally dependent. I could change in ways that don't feel safe. Instead of moving closer to the person they care about, they instinctively create distance. That doesn't always happen because your value has decreased. In many cases, it happens because your importance has increased beyond what their emotional defenses know how to handle. On a subconscious level, many avoidants carry the belief that forming a deep attachment comes with an unbearable cost. Somewhere inside, they fear that if they truly let someone in, they'll either lose their sense of identity or eventually experience pain that feels impossible to recover from. Even when they desperately want lasting connection, they often struggle to believe it can actually last. Security feels unfamiliar. Permanence feels uncertain. So the moment they realize you genuinely matter, a new kind of pressure begins building inside them. They feel pressure to remain emotionally consistent, pressure to meet your expectations, pressure to stay vulnerable, pressure to keep the relationship emotionally alive. And for someone whose nervous system associates closeness with danger, pressure almost automatically activates avoidance. Creating distance becomes the quickest way to calm the emotional intensity they don't fully understand. Stepping back feels safer than staying emotionally exposed. In their mind, space protects them from becoming too dependent, too attached, or too vulnerable. The heartbreaking reality is that the people who could have offered them the greatest sense of emotional safety often become the very people they push away the most. This also explains why many avoidants can remain emotionally connected long after they've physically withdrawn. They may never send another message, yet you still cross their mind. They may avoid commitment, yet quietly compare every new relationship to what they experienced with you. They may date other people, hoping something feels easier, but discover that no connection carries the same emotional depth. That's because what you gave them wasn't simply affection or attention. You offered genuine emotional resonance. You awakened parts of them that had been asleep for years. You helped them experience feelings they had spent a lifetime keeping buried. And once those emotions have been awakened, they rarely disappear completely. Instead of allowing themselves to move toward those feelings, they often place them into emotional compartments. They bury themselves in work, routines, constant activity, distractions, or logical explanations that make retreat feel reasonable. They tell themselves things like, "It probably wouldn't have worked anyway. I wasn't ready for a serious relationship. They deserved someone better." These explanations help reduce the discomfort, but they don't erase the emotional impact of the connection. The feelings remain beneath the surface, even if they rarely admit that to themselves. Those explanations aren't really about you at all. They're stories the avoidant mind creates to protect itself from emotions that feel too overwhelming to face directly. One of the hardest parts of this entire dynamic is that many avoidants don't consciously recognize why they suddenly feel the need to withdraw. They don't wake up one morning thinking, "This person means so much to me, so I need to disappear." Instead, they simply experience an internal sense of discomfort that seems to come out of nowhere. Their nervous system begins telling them that they need space. It urges them to slow everything down, regain emotional distance, and restore the sense of control they've always relied on. Because they've spent much of their lives trusting independence more than emotional communication, they usually follow that instinct automatically, rather than stopping to understand where it's coming from. While they're trying to regulate themselves, you're left carrying the confusion. You replay every conversation in your mind. You analyze every message. You wonder whether you said the wrong thing, asked for too much, or somehow caused them to lose interest. But in many situations, none of those things were the real issue. The relationship itself became the trigger. Not your personality, not your emotional needs, not your affection, not your desire for closeness. It was the depth of the bond that awakened fears they had spent years keeping buried. This is exactly why pursuing an avoidant usually creates the opposite of the result you're hoping for. The more you move toward them, the more their nervous system experiences pursuit instead of comfort. The more reassurance you seek, the more pressure they begin to feel. The more you try to define the relationship or create certainty, the more they experience the situation as emotionally confining. Ironically, the very things you're asking for, stability, consistency, emotional availability, and genuine security, are often the same things they secretly wish they could experience. The difference is that they don't trust themselves to maintain that level of intimacy. A part of them longs for lasting love, another part fears it with equal intensity. Rather than facing that inner conflict, they create distance. They convince themselves that stepping away is the safest option. For a brief moment, distance quiets their anxiety, but over time, that same distance quietly strengthens the loneliness they were trying to escape. This understanding isn't meant to encourage you to accept emotional inconsistency or spend years waiting for someone to overcome patterns they aren't actively working to change. Instead, it helps free you from one of the most painful assumptions people make after an avoidant leaves, the belief that you weren't enough, or that you somehow loved too much. In many cases, neither is true. You were simply someone who felt emotionally genuine. You offered stability instead of games. You created safety instead of chaos. You showed up with presence, consistency, and the possibility of a relationship that carried real emotional depth. For someone whose survival has long depended on avoiding emotional dependence, that kind of connection doesn't always feel peaceful. It can feel deeply unsettling, not because there is anything wrong with you, but because authentic intimacy asks them to face parts of themselves they have spent years trying not to feel. Avoidants don't necessarily keep their distance because you lacked value. Very often they stay away because your value was impossible for them to ignore, and that emotional significance challenged the protective walls they had built around their heart. They create distance because your presence begins to challenge the emotional defenses they spent years building just to survive. Those walls were never designed to keep love out, they were built to keep pain out. But over time, the two became impossible to separate. And when someone comes along who genuinely reaches their heart, those defenses don't simply disappear, they resist. They fight to stay in place because letting them fall feels uncertain, unfamiliar, and frightening. That's why one of the most freeing realizations you can have is this. You don't need to keep proving your worth to someone who already recognizes it, but lacks the emotional ability to receive it fully. There comes a moment when everything begins to change, not because the avoidant suddenly changes, but because you do. You stop seeing their distance as evidence that you weren't enough. Instead, you begin recognizing it for what it often is, a reflection of their emotional limitations, not your value. You stop carrying the weight of their silence as though it defines your worth. You stop assuming every unanswered message or every moment of withdrawal says something about who you are. Instead, you start protecting your own emotional well-being. You begin honoring your own needs instead of constantly managing someone else's fears. Ironically, this is often the point where the emotional balance shifts. As long as you're chasing someone who keeps stepping away, the relationship remains trapped in an exhausting cycle. The more you pursue, the more they retreat. The more they retreat, the more uncertain you become. That uncertainty fuels even more pursuit, and the pattern repeats itself again and again. But when you finally stop running after someone who continues creating distance, you interrupt that cycle. You stop handing your peace to another person's inability to stay emotionally present. You stop shrinking your personality, suppressing your needs, or becoming less expressive just to make someone else feel comfortable. Instead, you reclaim something much more valuable, your emotional integrity. You remember that healthy love should never require you to abandon yourself in order to keep someone else from leaving. Whether the avoidant eventually returns or never comes back at all becomes far less important than the fact that you have stepped outside the pattern that kept you questioning your own worth. That is real freedom, because healthy relationships are not built on constantly earning someone's affection. They aren't sustained by guessing what version of yourself will finally make another person feel safe enough to stay. Real connection allows both people to remain authentic without living in fear of emotional punishment. The truth is simple. The right relationship will never demand that you silence your own emotional needs just to feel chosen. Love that is emotionally healthy doesn't treat closeness like a threat. It doesn't punish vulnerability. It doesn't create confusion every time intimacy deepens. Someone who is genuinely prepared for a mature relationship may still have fears, insecurities, or difficult moments, but they won't repeatedly run every time the connection becomes meaningful. They'll choose to face those fears alongside you instead of escaping from them. So if an avoidant walked away, despite the fact that you shared something special, don't mistake that as a reason to keep waiting indefinitely. Instead of allowing their withdrawal to convince you that you somehow weren't enough, let it remind you of something far more important. The way someone responds to emotional closeness says as much about their inner world as it does about the relationship itself. If an avoidant stepped away, that doesn't automatically mean you failed or that your love lacked value. In many cases, it means the connection reached a level they didn't know how to navigate. Never mistake another person's emotional limitations for proof of your inadequacy. Your ability to love deeply is not a flaw. The fact that you can care wholeheartedly, show empathy, remain emotionally available, and invest yourself in someone else is not something you should ever feel embarrassed about. Those qualities don't make you weak. They are evidence of emotional maturity. In today's world, where many people hide behind emotional walls and fear vulnerability, the courage to genuinely connect with another human being is incredibly rare. Don't let one person's inability to receive your love convince you that your love was too much. It wasn't. Your willingness to build real emotional intimacy is not something you need to apologize for or suppress. Healthy relationships are built through openness, honesty, trust, and emotional consistency. Those aren't unrealistic expectations. They are the foundation of secure connection. You should never feel pressured to become emotionally smaller, simply to make someone else feel emotionally safer. Likewise, your desire for closeness should never be treated as a character flaw. Wanting consistency isn't being needy. Wanting communication isn't asking for too much. Wanting emotional presence isn't unrealistic. Those are healthy human needs, and they deserve to be met by someone who values connection rather than fears it. Your capacity to create deep emotional bonds deserves someone who can receive that love with openness instead of seeing it as a threat. You deserve someone who doesn't panic when the relationship becomes meaningful. Someone who doesn't confuse intimacy with losing themselves. Someone who sees emotional closeness as something to nurture instead of something to escape. If today's message resonates with your own experience, carry this final reminder with you. When someone pulls away, don't immediately assume it happened because you weren't enough. Distance is not always a reflection of your value. Sometimes it's simply evidence that the relationship awakened emotions the other person wasn't emotionally equipped to handle. Your presence challenged defenses they had relied on for years. Your consistency exposed fears they had kept hidden. Your love invited vulnerability they didn't yet know how to embrace. That reality may not erase the hurt, but it can help release you from a burden you were never meant to carry. You don't have to keep blaming yourself for someone else's emotional struggle. You don't have to spend months, or even years, searching for answers from someone who cannot honestly explain their own behavior. You don't have to chase closure from someone who keeps running from emotional depth. Instead, choose something healthier. Choose clarity over constant confusion. Choose peace over emotional chaos. Choose self-respect over endlessly waiting for someone to become the person you hope they might one day be. Choose healing over repeating the same painful cycle with someone who remains emotionally unavailable. Remember, real love isn't measured by how much uncertainty you can tolerate. It isn't proven by how long you can wait. It isn't earned by sacrificing your own emotional well-being. Healthy love creates safety. It creates trust. It creates stability. Most importantly, it creates an environment where both people feel secure enough to grow instead of feeling forced to protect themselves from one another. The people who are truly prepared for a meaningful relationship don't disappear the moment emotions become real. They don't run every time vulnerability enters the conversation. Instead, they acknowledge their fears, communicate openly, and work through difficult moments together because they understand that lasting love isn't built by avoiding discomfort. It's built by facing it side by side. That is the kind of relationship worth investing in. That is the kind of connection that allows both people to become stronger rather than more guarded. And above all, that is the kind of love you deserve. Here at Avoider, our purpose goes beyond simply explaining avoidant attachment or decoding confusing relationship behaviors. We want to help you understand the deeper psychological patterns that shape these experiences, so you can stop blaming yourself for dynamics that were never entirely yours to carry. The more clearly you understand these patterns, the easier it becomes to recognize what is healthy, what is emotionally sustainable, and what truly supports your long-term well-being. Because understanding is always the first step toward healing, and healing is what gives you the freedom to stop chasing unavailable love, break old emotional cycles, and choose relationships built on mutual trust, emotional safety, consistency, and genuine connection.